Thanks very much, Helen, and thanks for the opportunity to speak this afternoon. Before I begin, though, I'd like to thank Simon Reeves, who's going to be speaking later after me, because I'd kept a file on the fishbowl that Simon had given to me, I think now 20 years ago. Well, it might be 20 years ago, I think. Anyway, it's proved to be very useful. And also two students of mine, Hans Liu and Jingyi Ma from last year, who worked with me, and Alan Pert on an exhibition we did at Walsh Street in South Yarra. On the 24th of November 1970, a new takeaway seafood outlet, Neptune's Fishbowl, opened to great fanfare at 312 to 314 Toorak Road in South Yarra. The launch began with the arrival of an open truck of Fred Asmussen, silvered and floating in blue and white chiffon as King Neptune, together with the blonde model Barbara Challenor, bare-breasted with pasties, of course, and with a silver-covered mermaid's undercarriage. Behind the striking new outlet with its blue ball-shaped structure over the selling area, there was a marquee set up over the parking area, where a couple of hundred Melbourne socialites, together with the press, were packed in, drinking champagne and eating from trays of seafood, with, and I quote, "not a daub of Urki batter in sight." Guests were given red goldfish in water-filled plastic bags as they left. An MC of the event was hairdressing empress and Toorak socialite Lillian Frank, whose husband, restaurateur Richard Frank, and businessman Peter Shelmerdine were joint owners of the new fast food venture. Also at the opening was the fishbowl's architect, the well-known Robin Boyd, who, when interviewed by The Age's Max Beattie, said in an Oscar Wilde-like moment, and I quote, "Some people will hate it and some people will love it. This is better than not being noticed at all." Boyd's remark was prophetic. Neptune's Fishbowl did capture the public's attention. It was not only a challenge to the increasing phenomenon of roadside drive-in takeaway food outlets springing up across Australia, it was also a challenge to Boyd's own diatribe against visual pollution of the urban environment that he'd so vehemently championed 10 years before in his book The Australian Ugliness of 1960, and where he had coined the term featurism. So what I'm going to do this afternoon is outline Boyd's design, its genesis and its reception amongst the public and the profession. And the paper argues that the fishbowl was not only part of a shifting post-war roadside landscape in Australia, but also that its design sources actually ran counter to an emerging acceptance that the automobile urban-related environment was playing a decisive role in radically shifting opinions about the aesthetics of the late 20th century city. The concept for Neptune's Fishbowl had been developed by émigré restaurateur Richard Frank and Peter Shelmerdine, intent on putting the seafood takeaway business on an international footing and developing recipes adaptable to comparable seafood across the globe. Shelmerdine said bravely at the opening, "It's time Australia dealt out the franchises instead of buying them from America. We've already had inquiries from Honolulu." The plan was, given success in South Yarra, to open up a chain of Neptune's Fishbowls across Australia's east coast, with figures like 200 being mentioned. At the time of the bowl's design and documentation, other sites targeted in Melbourne included Burke Road in Camberwell, right next to the railway station, Burwood Road in Hawthorn, a site in Kew, sites in Balaclava, Notting Hill, Sandringham and Preston. The aim was to challenge the increasing presence of international chains like Kentucky Fried Chicken and Red Barn, and locally also to challenge Homestead Golden Chicken, of course, this is at Gosford, and to refashion the common image of fish and chips in newspaper, instead with smartly named items on the menu like, and this is the menu from the fishbowl, lobster capricornia, horn of plenty, which is chips, and bimby apple turnovers. Boyd's final design for the chain's initial and signature outlet in South Yarra comprised a 14-sided polygonal sales kiosk sitting on a concrete slab with a broad-eaved polygonal flat roof surmounted by the eye-catching blue fiberglass sphere, which acted like a giant sign, and also formed a skylight over the counter and concealed preparation area behind. Norman Day, recently graduated and working in the Romberg and Boyd office, oversaw the documentation and construction of the project. Paraflood lights were arranged around the steel ring beam, supporting the sphere to flood light into it at night. So you'd have this blue, if you like, sphere on Toorak Road at night. Customers could park at the rear and then make their way to the outlet's single front door facing Toorak Road. The fully air-conditioned service area was carpeted, internal lights were golden yellow spheres, and there were 3 stools of white nylon steel based with Cordova vinyl turquoise cushions. And assistants wore outfits of lemon prestoline and gold gabardine. The sphere itself, or the dome, some might have described it as, which Boyd intended would symbolise the name of the chain, was the most sophisticated aspect of the design. After investigating Viking Industrial Plastics K-dome and a triadetic space frame dome covered with Alcan aluminium sheet roofing, it was decided instead to create a snub dodecahedron that you see here, not a geodesic dome, as a self-supporting structure, comprising 60 identical triangles, each approximately 6 by 6 feet by 7 feet. All the triangles were shaped to conform to the surface of the sphere. As the press release recounted, when 5 triangles are joined, they form a pentagonal segment of a sphere. 12 pentagons form the sphere, which is 20 feet in diameter. Now, computations for the sphere were undertaken by Dr. Louis Christian Schmidt, an expert in trusses and minimum weight structures from the School of Engineering here at the University of Melbourne. And it was designed by Computer Analysis on the university's relatively new $2 million IBM 744 computer. The computer produced a drawing of the 3-dimensional sphere, which couldn't be drawn by normal geometrical methods, and thus it enabled precise dimensions, angles, and a grid layout of the sphere structure. Made entirely of glass-reinforced polymer, fiberglass, and assembled off-site by Trimview, Polymarble and Fiberglass in Ferntree Gully, it was then craned in and dropped gently onto the awaiting timber and steel frame kiosk structure below, and then bolted into place. In the months after its opening, receptions to Neptune's Fishbowl was mixed. From the public, there was a mixture of mild outrage that Robin Boyd could have designed such a structure. But even before the Fishbowl had opened, Boyd had received a letter from Martin Elks, a 4th form schoolboy from Peninsula Grammar School in Mount Eliza, who'd written to Boyd quizzing him directly. And I quote, this is from the 4th, it's very articulate, 4th former. How can you distinguish a food shop made to look like a red barn from a fish shop made to look like a fish bowl? Surely both are examples of featureism. Your answer to this question would be most appreciated, as our art master cannot give an answer. Boyd had put some time into his response, saying that he didn't see any consistency between the 2 buildings, between Red Barn and the Fishbowl, and he further elaborated. This is Boyd writing, "I have never objected to advertisements if they are well designed, or to having a bit of fun in the design of buildings, if it is appropriate. I look mainly for an idea, that is, one main idea per building, instead of the more usual assortment of little ideas which are shaken up together to make a building. Typically, the feature market, with its many loud, stale ideas mixed together. On the other hand, this is Boyd again, still talking, Red Barn is not a featurist so much as an idea building, and I don't dislike it as much as I do a shambles like the New World supermarket. The thing that I do find slightly objectionable, and this is about Red Barn, is that its idea is pretty weak. The stage setting it creates is so unimaginative, nostalgic, foreign, gaudy, and unamusing. Boyd went on to argue that his design was never intended to imitate a real fishbowl, but instead the sphere was intended to be, and I quote, a memorable emblem which may be associated with the idea of fish. He concluded his letter concluding, if you don't agree, if you think it looks as gaudy and as silly as a New World supermarket, that is a matter of taste. But I hope you will agree that it has only one idea, simply carried through, and that you can see that the thinking behind it and the New World started out from opposite ends of the span of architectural motivations. Boyd's private response coincided with some public negative press. Barbara Bishop in the Sunday Observer commented of the fishbowl, and I quote, what many people believe to be the last word in ugliness, and which Tony Moran, director of the Industrial Design Council, he compared it with the Kentucky Fried Chicken and Red Barn monstrosities. Boyd's response was the same. He defended it as, and I quote, fun architecture, a term he'd never used before. Boyd's measured response, in many respects less strident than his 1960 assault on taste in the Australian Ugliness, reflected his own changing personal views on what constituted contemporary architecture. While in 1960 he'd been virulent in his attacks on the Holden Special, which I spoke about at 2 conferences ago, and the car-connected urban culture of motels and surface paradise, and the looming spectre of what he described as googie architecture, by 1970 things had changed. Internationally, the most prominent and what would become internationally influential revisionist ideas on the commercial strip were those of Philadelphia-based architects and husband and wife team of Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown. In the late 1960s, they began to publish their ideas on the importance of acknowledging that the automobile had recast traditional notions of not just urban space, but also architectural meaning and composition. Their first article was entitled A Significance for A&P Parking Lots, or Learning from Las Vegas, and was published in the American journal Architectural Forum, and this is the cover of the journal, in March of 1968. Robin Boyd was on this same journal's board of contributors, so we know he's sure to have read and been aware of the Venturi's increasing presence in American architecture culture, including in the very next month's issue where examples of Venturi's work abounded, particularly Venturi's ideas on the billboard. The Venturis mounted a persuasive argument for orthodox architecture culture to get over its aesthetic and ethical bias against the roadside landscape. They wrote, the commercial strip, the Las Vegas Strip in particular, it is the example par excellence. It challenges the architect to take a positive, non-chip-on-the-shoulder view. Architects are out of the habit of looking non-judgmentally at the environment because orthodox modern architecture is progressive, if not revolutionary, utopian and puristic. It's dissatisfied with the existing conditions. Modern architecture has been anything but permissive. For the Venturis, the expanded landscape of the highway and the commercial strip offered new aesthetic possibilities, therefore, on the basis of acceptance rather than rejection of its existence. The Venturis, therefore, were excited by, and I'm quoting again, the vast and complex setting of a new landscape of big spaces, high speeds, and complex programs. Styles and signs make connections among many elements far apart and seen fast. The message is basically commercial, but the context is basically new, end of quote. The experience of this form of city visually was essentially car-based and required the architect to adopt new techniques and strategies to recognise and deal with its special qualities. At the same time, the Venturis added that, and I quote, at another scale, the shopping centre off the highway returns in its pedestrian malls to the medieval street. Significantly, the Venturis argued that the graphic sign in space has become the architecture in landscape. Indeed, they went further, claiming that the sign is more important than the architecture. And they included in this same article the rough version, seen on the bottom of this image, of their now famous diagram of architecture's 2 modes in this new landscape, the decorated shed, where the sign was everything and the building was small, and what they called the duck, where the building was sculptural symbol and architectural shelter all in one. Now, if you follow the Venturi's tenets, Boyd's fishbowl was clearly a duck, and a successful one at that, in the new landscape of big spaces, high speeds and complex programs. And it would be easy to think that Boyd was responding here not just to the practical whims of his clients, but also to the shifting, accurate and prescient musings on an automobile-based urbanism. But Boyd never acknowledged the Venturis as a design influence, nor did he comment in any detail on their theories. Instead, at the time, what was preoccupying him in his practice and in his international writings was the architecture of the International Exposition. A visitor to, a commentator on, and a designer for expos, Boyd sustained a decade-long interest in the exposition as a site of modernism's shifting and, as he admitted himself, uncertain evolution. If one looks differently at Neptune's fishbowl from the perspective of an architect used to solving the issue of identity, symbolism, and the holding of visual attention through the auspices of refined design, heightened spatial and sensory experience, or technological invention, then all of a sudden, the appearance of the fishbowl from the hands of Australia's arch anti-featurists seems expected, even welcomed. So the fishbowl, even from its conceptual beginnings, and these are Robin's drawings from the State Library of Victoria, what has been about a sign. And if one looks then at expo architecture, one could say that the fishbowl could be abstracted from the base building of the atomium. So if you look very closely, look, there's the fishbowl there, which Boyd had visited. So this is Brussels, 1958. Or it might have been Boyd's wish to explore the ideas of Buckminster Fuller, on display at virtually every expo since 1967, or to explore the high technology of lightweight structures. This is the US pavilion on the left, as opposed to the fishbowl. And here we see Jim McCormick's Australian pavilion, and this is the US pavilion next door with that same lightweight lattice roof. Or it might have been a combined wish to extend ideas of his own. So in that same Australian pavilion, Boyd is designed by Jim McCormick, but Boyd is the exhibits designer. So this is one of Robin's exhibit designs in the centre, of course, that you see there. Or more particularly, as Norman Day has hinted, Boyd may have borrowed conceptually from the Ryco Pavilion at Expo 70 that you see here. So fishbowl on the right and Ryco Pavilion on the two images on the left. The Ryco Pavilion had an inflatable pneumatic sphere, a balloon, sitting atop a grey cylinder, which in the daytime was a strong and simple message. While at night, the sphere, illuminated from within, lifted off into the night to become the eye of the sky that you see there. It's lifting off on the far left. Perhaps one of the first aerial drones. Then the grey cylinder actually came into its known at night as a projection screen. So at night the ball lifted off, and then the grey cylinder had movies projected onto it. Each night, the balloon lifted off and then a film was projected onto the cylinder exterior. As Peter van Westermael has written of the Ryco Pavilion, there was no longer mention of an architectural facade, but rather of the architecture of projections. Boyd's fishbowl might then be seen as Boyd resolutely anti-featurist, immersed in contemporary thinking about sophisticated new structure, integrated design, and part of a larger international conversation about architecture. That was his intellectual context. But back to South Yarra. Neptune's fishbowl lasted just 2 years to the day. Almost. At 11 a.m. on the 21st of November 1972, the building, with a sign attached saying, "Take it from here," and its food equipment, together with a 1968 Mercedes-Benz, was all put up for auction by Mason, Green and Associates. The building was dismantled and taken away, but no one knows where. There were rumours of fragments of the sphere being stored by Shelmerdine at his brother Ross's winery at Mitchelton. Boyd himself was able to have no opinion on the matter. He died in October 1971, a year before, too early to see the demise of his experimental architecture for the roadside. There is some irony that the Venturi's book, Learning from Las Vegas, on the far left, published in 1972, became internationally influential. And further, in 1984, in the centre, the Venturis proposed something similar for New York, the Big Apple at Times Square. So, to conclude, the complete history of Australia's roadside architecture has yet to be written. There are highs and lows, as well as even heritage listings. This is the Big Pineapple. Buildings of pedigree, this is Bruce Rickard for Cobb & Co, as buildings with pedigree and buildings with none, but very popular that we see here at Ballina, the Big Prawn. But there is little doubt that as physical and cultural landmarks, as bearers of popular imagery and as markers of a road trip, they have been an integral part of our urban, peri-urban, rural and coastal landscapes. Robin Boyd's fishbowl is part of that story, though one suspects he may not have wished it. Thanks very much.